Hello again, higher biology pupils. Mr. Kinnear here with another video lesson for higher biology, Unit 3 Sustainability and Interdependence. And today we're going to look at crop protection, which is key area 3.3. So this is where it fits in terms of the whole unit. Obviously, we've talked already about food supply, food security, photosynthesis, and then breeding. So crop protection is where we're at just now, and then we'll go further into welfare, symbiosis, social behaviour, and biodiversity in the later half of the unit. In the last lesson, we talked about plant and animal breeding for farming, which has been going on for about 10,000 years. And in the vast majority of that time, people have been growing food and rearing animals to feed themselves, their family units, maybe their settlements. Some of that may be sold on so that they could go and buy other resources, other bits and pieces. So that farming model was very much about polyculture, growing different crops, and that may be different times of the year to obviously feed themselves throughout the year. You might still see that kind of methods in small cooperatives, or maybe people growing at home, where they grow not just one crop, but a huge variety of crops. However, since the Industrial Revolution, Agricultural Revolution, we've seen that uh, a lot of farms are just one thing. So you might just now find sheep farmers or dairy farmers or um, cereal farmers. So they might just grow one crop, and then they then go and sell that on to wholesalers who then put that food into the variety of different pipelines, whether it's direct to supermarkets or into people who will make something from that. So the traditional farming or polyculture uh, doesn't exist on a huge level scale. So what we're going to look at is the monoculture, which is now the more modern version of that, which means that people are growing one crop. So monoculture pretty much is the standard for modern agriculture. It increases the yield and it minimises labour costs. If you've only got one crop, then the jobs and the machinery you need to employ are far less varied. With a variety of different crops, then there's different jobs, therefore different labour and machinery. Um, it does, however, mean that crop protection is essential to ensure we get the good harvests. And that monoculture, so one massive field of the same crop, does mean that pests and weeds and disease causing microorganisms can spread through that crop a lot easier than if they were separated out by different crops side by side. It does also mean that farmers have to employ a variety of control methods to protect their crops and avoid economic disaster. And even last year, we had a massive issue with the really bad turn of events in terms of weather that our flour stock was massively impacted because the wheat production within the UK was massively impacted. So we had about a 40% downturn in our flour production through wheat. So obviously that has a massive impact on the farmers in the UK, but also then the potential for um, the food supply relying on obviously wheat, flour, bread. The first problem we're going to talk about are weeds. And a weed is any kind of plant that grows where it's not wanted. So if you're growing wheat, then any other plant in there is a weed and it's going to cause you problems. The space between the monoculture is prime growing location for these plants. It does cause a significant reduction in the productivity due to composition. So they're going to compete for the water, the nutrients in the soil. They also release chemical inhibitors to reduce crop growth. And as well, if you're growing wheat and you're obviously going to sell on the grains to go to the flour mill, if that's contaminated with seeds from weeds, then that's going to be a problem. That's going to reduce your value. But they also act as hosts for crop pests and diseases, which again furthers the issue. So there's two types of weeds we need to know about. Annual weeds, as their name suggests, they have a short life cycle. They can colonize an empty field incredibly quickly. So they can grow quickly, they produce lots of flowers and seeds incredibly quickly. But the seeds they do produce can remain viable in the ground for some time. And secondly, perennial weeds. So they're ones that can compete quite successfully with the crops that you're going to introduce. and they're already established. They have storage organs from previous years. So again, they could have an energy source. So the conditions aren't perfect for photosynthesis. They still have energy stores under the ground, and they can reproduce using runners. So an example there, you've got blackberries. Now, again, you might not think of blackberry as a weed. You've even got Scottish national flower, the thistle, in there as well. But blackberry obviously can bring a runner into your environment, and as delicious as they may be, they'll still contaminate the crop that you do want to grow. So that may be a problem. So they will compete very quickly through the asexual reproduction through runners, as well as the storage organs under the ground. So three major groups of invertebrates that cause lots of problems: nematode worms, mollusks, so snails and slugs, and insects. They can reduce photosynthesis, so less sugar produced. They can drink the sap, therefore less energy supplied to the tissues. And that can reduce vigour and the yield of your crops. But they can also be a carrier for disease, which can also damage the crop. And those diseases might be caused by fungi, bacteria, and viruses. And here's some examples of diseases caused. And obviously, the host plant or the crop is going to be damaged, and therefore the yield and the productivity of your farm is going to be impacted by that. So we have developed a variety of non-chemical methods to control these issues, things that have been developed through traditional farming over the course of centuries, if not millennia, through trial and error. Simple things like ploughing, burying perennial weeds so they die and compose. At the critical time of sowing, so when annual weeds are dormant and perennials have been ploughed. Removal of weeds early in the crop life cycle, so that it gives them less competition and therefore more chances to get stronger. Removal of alternative hosts, so making clear areas around the edge of fields, remove those pests. However, it can have an impact on wildlife, and obviously that is then something that people are looking at in modern agriculture. Destruction of crop residue. You may have seen this in farms around you, where stubble is burned at the end of the harvest. And you might think, what on earth is that doing? But they're getting rid of potential pathogens that are left in that stubble that might go into your new crop. A cover crop, so lessening the chance of an annual weed coming in there and getting a foothold. So you put down a cover crop that can compete successfully with those weeds. And again, crop rotation, so moving different crops into your field every single year. So it means that if a pest is in that field that was growing on wheat, but the next year you add in clover, then there's less chance of the pest again getting a foothold within your crops. Unfortunately, though, those traditional methods are not always good enough for our new intensive farming methods. So that means we bring in chemical control, so herbicides, pesticides, and fungicides. And there's different versions of each of them, which we'll go through on an individual basis. As the name suggests, herbicides are crop protection chemicals that kill off plants, or weeds as we're looking at. Selective herbicides, they mimic plant growth hormones, so they instruct the plant to overgrow, outdo its resources, and therefore die. They're normally biodegradable, be broken down in the environment. Contact herbicides are non-selective, therefore they kill off all green plants. And so obviously you treat it by actually making contact with the plants you're trying to kill. So that might be quite labour intensive. They don't have an effect on underground organs, so established perennials will be able to re-emerge from their underground organs. And systemic herbicides, so they are actually absorbed into the circulatory system. So xylem and phloem, it goes up and down through the plant, and it obviously affects the entire plant. So it kills off their roots and underground storage systems as well. And that picture is an example of a kind of commercially available weed killer. So just as we have three main pest groups, we've also got three different types of pesticide. So as the name suggests, insecticide, molluscicide, nematicide, to affect the particular groups. And there's different ways of getting them into the environment and the pests. So they're extensively used in agriculture. They prevent about 30% of crop loss in Scotland, and they can either be contact or systemic. With your contact pesticides working in two ways, either killing the invertebrate when they come into contact or leaving a residue to kill future invertebrates. And the systemic, they're absorbed by the plant and only kill invertebrates that actually ingest or eat the plant material. Equally, we'll have two different types of fungicides. Contact fungicides, which are sprayed onto crops. They're absorbed by the fungal spores, causing the fungus to die. They can be easily washed away and need to be reapplied to crops regularly. And the systemic fungicides absorbed by the plant and therefore not washed away, and they give better protection that kill only the fungi that are affecting the crop plant. An advantage of fungicides, you can actually spray them on ahead of time. So if the conditions are going to be right for infection, you can get ahead of the game. So for instance, potato blight requires certain temperature and humidity levels. So the farmer can apply the fungicide in advance, therefore prevention is better than treatment. You may well know that we have problems with chemicals within agriculture. Some people have real issues with it. Some of that is based on real, genuine concerns. Some of it, again, with things that are not necessarily based on science. Plant protection should be specific to the pest concerned. It should be short-lived, so it should biodegrade within the environment, and it should be safe for animals and humans. Obviously, if we're feeding humans with this stuff, then it needs to be safe. But the problems that do include toxicity to animal species, so killing off things that shouldn't be, persistence in the environment, so not biodegrading and building up within organisms, and then accumulating. So the big thing with DDT was it was building up within sparrowhawks and other birds of prey. That led to them softening the eggs, and when they obviously sat on them to incubate them, then they broke and therefore killing off the young within their eggs. That was due to accumulation of that pesticide within the food chain. And obviously, we can also develop resistance to natural selection. If one pest, Colorado beetle being an example, develops a resistance to it, then it's going to survive the constant sprayings, and therefore, through natural selection, we're going to develop resistance within quite a wide range of organisms and population. So there are other methods. Biological controls are something we talked about in National 5 biology. That's the control of a pest population through introduction of its natural enemies, which will control it. That could be predators. So, for example, the ladybird feeding on aphids. You've got parasites, and there's the example of this parasitic wasp laying eggs inside whitefly, which obviously then come out and eat the whitefly as they grow. And the pathogen, which we talked about in a roundabout sort of way during genetic engineering, because that Bt toxin is something that kills off caterpillars. So the bacteria can do that, and that's where we took the Bt toxin gene in our genetic engineering example in our last lesson. So like everything, biological controls have positive and negatives. They do work well within enclosed systems like glasshouse, greenhouses, polytunnels, etc., as long as you get the timing right when you're introducing the agents. But the negative side being that if they do escape from your control environment, they can cause other problems. So they then can become an invasive species, which is something we'll look at later on in the units when we're looking at biodiversity. Given that we've talked about a variety of pros and cons of each of the different methods, it's very clear that we need to use a combination approach, and that's what integrated pest management is. So it's a combination of chemical, biological, and cultural methods, as well as plant resistance to improve our yield. That therefore allows us to reduce chemical use biodegradable chemicals, and reduce pest numbers to levels not causing economic damage, and then we can use the biological methods as well. So the majority of certainly Western agriculture is using this integrated pest management to manage and control pests and therefore improve yields. And that leads us to the end of the lesson for today. So today we talked about weeds competing with crops and other pests and diseases damaging crop plants, all of which reduce the productivity. and that then damages our capability of food security. We can manage those damages by cultural, chemical, and biological methods. But each of them, as I've just said, have pros and cons. The sensible way forward then is to use this integrated pest management, and that's the way the majority of Western agricultural use. So a combination of chemical, biological, and cultural control. So that's us. Hopefully you found that informative. If you have any problems, as usual, give me a shout and I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye.